everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm really excited and happy to introduce Professor Melissa Siegel. I had to write this down because of your title is so long. She is the head of Migration Studies and the head of Migration and Development Research section at the United Nations University and Maastricht University in the Netherlands. And I've known Professor Siegel for many years now, and I can say with confidence that she has led or worked on or advised more migration-related research projects than any other academic I know. And she brings just a wealth of expertise and a very well-rounded view of migration and a real sensitivity to some of the more difficult policy questions that come with managing this incredibly important topic in our global world. One fun fact is she lived in North Carolina before, so we're very happy to welcome her back to talk with us today. And she'll be sharing, among many things, about a research project called migrants, which aim to advance new knowledge about the intersection of migration, development, and public policy. And it just recently concluded and wrapped up, and I'll let her share more about how much territory they covered with their surveys and interviews. But it really is at the forefront of, I think, migration research. And so we're very lucky to have her with us today and grateful she made the time to be with us at Wednesdays at the Center. So, Professor Siegel, I'll give it to you.
Thank you. No, I don't need this. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you so much for having me today, and hello to everyone also who is online. It is a pleasure for me to be here. So although I have lived all over the world, and I've been actually living and working in Europe now for the last 2 decades, I did do all of my elementary school in Chapel Hill. So yes, I have definitely lived in this area in the past, so it's fun for me to be back here. So what I'm going to do today is talk about the linkages between migration and development. And as was mentioned before, if you have questions for clarification, things like that along the way, feel free to just jump in. I'm happy to have this as more of a discussion. But maybe for the bigger structural things, we can talk about those at the end. And I will do my best to cover a lot of material in a short period of time. So I will start by talking a little bit about what is development. How does development affect migration? Then we'll talk about how migration can affect development. And then we'll talk about how not migrating, particularly when someone would like to migrate, how that can affect development. So maybe that's a perhaps much more understudied area. And when I'm talking about these different things, I will also give examples from this migrants project, which I will also explain. So what is development? We have a lot of different conceptualizations of what development is. All right, so in its most general form, right, development is a process of improving the overall quality of life for any given group of people, and this can be interpreted through a lot of different lenses. Some of the main ones are, and I would say the more old school thinking around development was to think about this through economic development, usually growth. Nowadays, we have moved past that, and we take a much more multidimensional approach to development. So it's not just about the economic side of things. It's not just about monetary development. It is about being able to do many things. It's about health. It's about education. It's about access to resources. So it's a lot more than just that economic side of things, and maybe many of you have heard of Amartya Sen, I am sure. And so this kind of multidimensional idea of development comes out of a lot of the work of Amartya Sen, looking at the expansion of capabilities and people being able to live a good life and what is a good life. So I just say this to say that in this talk, I'm going to be talking here about development mostly in a much more general context, all right? So looking at these different dimensions of the development, different aspects, but we will still look at part of the economic side, since that is also one of the dimensions, and it is still one of the ones that is easiest to measure. All right, so when we talk about the relationship between migration and development, we have multiple relationships. So one is that migration can definitely affect development, and that is one that you see worked on a lot in the literature. But development also affects migration, and this is, I think, one of the most misunderstood relationships also between migration and development, particularly when we talk about this from a policy context. There's a lot that policy gets wrong, misunderstands when we talk about this relationship. So how does development affect migration? Let's take this first. So this is some work from another colleague who I think gave a talk here already last year, Professor De Haas. And what we see here is this is kind of the theoretical model. So as development increases, you see that there's a pretty straightforward relationship with immigration. So immigration is people entering a country, okay? So as development goes up, the country becomes more attractive for migrants to come to, and so you can see that's pretty clear. Now, the relationship that is often misunderstood is on the emigration side, so people leaving their country, okay? So every migrant is both an immigrant and an emigrant. I currently live in the Netherlands. I'm originally born in the United States, so I am an emigrant from the US and an immigrant in the Netherlands. So the relationship here with emigration is, okay, at very low levels of development, you also have very low levels of emigration, and as development starts to increase, you start to see higher levels of immigration to a kind of tipping point where it starts to reduce but never goes to zero. All right, so this is in theory. So let's look at some of the actual work in practice. Let's look at some of the data. So again, this is some data from Professor Hein de Haas using the Human Development Index here. So we're not doing this based only on monetary areas. And you can see very clearly here with immigrants, it's the relationship that I showed you before. Okay, so as a country develops, they're attracting more and more migrants. But on the other side, on immigrants, you can see that at very low and low levels of development here, that we also have very low levels of migration. Then we come to middle development where you have a kind of tipping point where it starts to decrease, but is actually still at higher levels than at very low development, all right? So there are a number of reasons for this, but this is exactly where a lot of policy gets things wrong. So you'll probably often hear this rhetoric, if we just develop the countries that people are coming from, people will no longer migrate. All right, and this is because there are a lot of wrong assumptions about how, why, under what conditions people migrate, all right? If migration was only about poverty, I wouldn't be living in the Netherlands, right? I was born and raised in the US, it was fine, I didn't leave because of poverty, right? So there are a lot of different reasons why people migrate. But also, there are a lot of different capabilities. So at this area of the spectrum here, people have a very low capability to actually be able to migrate. So that you generally have lower levels of education here. You generally have lower networks, so people don't know as many people abroad. That can make it easier for them to migrate. It is actually generally harder to be able to leave from these kinds of countries, all right? At the same time, you might also have lower aspirations to migrate because people might not even have all of the information. They might not know everything that is out there for them to possibly be able to aspire to. And also on this side of the spectrum, you also have a lot of policies that make it harder to leave. So one thing is that the easiest way to migrate nowadays is if you are highly skilled. There are lots of highly skilled visas, so it's much easier to migrate if you have tertiary levels of education, perhaps if you have a master's or a PhD, if you're a doctor. Those are the people who it is easiest to migrate in general around the world. These countries are producing less of those people, all right? And then on top of that, you also have that the countries where people want to go to have a lot of different kinds of visas. And usually it's a lot easier to migrate, for example, from the US to the Netherlands than it is to migrate from Zambia to the Netherlands, right? So I don't need an entry visa already to enter the Netherlands. I can just be on holiday there, no problem. But someone from Zambia can't do that very easily, all right? So there are also policy things going on here. And I know part of this seminar series is also about justice, so you can also think about passport justice and where you're born really affects also your ability to migrate and move around the world. Now, when we get to middle developed countries, what we see here is, at least from this data, we see that there is a peak here, all right? So here you could argue that these are the people who could gain the most from migration, but they actually can't migrate, or they're having a hard time migrating. Here, you still have people who can gain a lot from migration. There are still big income differentials in what they can receive, but here you start to have higher levels of education, higher levels of development. So think about a country like the Philippines. All right, so in the Philippines, most people still have secondary levels of education. Actually, their English is pretty good, so it's quite easy for them to migrate around the world. You've probably heard of all of the Filipino nurses that are all over the world. So they also have these skill levels that are very, very much wanted in other parts of the world. So here you kind of have the perfect storm of, okay, it becomes easier to migrate, and people have more capabilities to migrate, and they can still have a lot of returns to that migration. Once we move over to the high end of the spectrum, here we start to talk about the global race for talent and countries trying to attract the best and the brightest. So here on the policy front, it becomes very easy to migrate. I mean, comparatively, very easy to migrate from a policy or administrative perspective. And people have a lot of capabilities. They have a lot of resources. They're often very highly skilled. They often have networks in other countries. It's often easy for them to get access to the information that they would need to migrate. So that is why we see what we see here. But this is something that is very much misunderstood by policymakers. And I would also say the general public. And what we also see is that even, so this was data from 2005, actually. Newer data is showing us actually a much more extreme case. But first, let me show you where this official tipping point is. So if we look at this actually in monetary terms, what you can see is that this tipping point of where migration would start to decrease would be anywhere, let's say, between $8,000 and about $12,000 per capita per year in purchasing power parity. So we're actually talking about a pretty good level of monetary development. Most countries in the world are not there, okay? So already if we would just say, okay, put more money into developing countries, therefore people will stop migrating, these are countries that are here right now. So even if you, let's say, start to help those countries develop at a more rapid rate, they're going to come here, and it's very likely they're going to have way more migration before they ever hit that tipping point, all right? So more recent data from 2020 is actually showing us an even different story now. So that it's not even that you get this hump here. More recently, so this is a snapshot of data at one point in time, you're actually seeing that with both emigration and immigration, as a country develops, you see more of both, all right? So you see a lot of migration from highly developed countries and very high developed countries. So if you already think about where I'm living, in the European Union, right? The European Union is, 28 countries where there are no borders. You can go live and work in any of those other countries. And those are, very highly developed countries already. So you see this happening more and more now. We see this trend happening. All right. So that's a little bit about how development can affect migration more generally. Now, how do development interventions affect migration decisions? And when I talk about development interventions here, I'm going to talk about a lot of things having to do with aid or social programs that are sometimes and often specifically targeted towards areas with the implicit or explicit purpose of trying to reduce migration from those areas, okay? So if we take this at a little bit more micro or meso approach, let's see. Now, so we have some important questions here. So to ask that question, we need to first know, okay, what are development interventions? Do they work? Meaning, do they increase development? And then do they actually deter people wanting to migrate, all right? So the first thing, so there's this idea of trying to assess the so-called root causes of migration that has been really, really popular in policy circles. So there are a number of different types of interventions that we see in these areas. So they can be social protection programs, cash transfers, employment creation, insurance programs, skills training, support to small and medium-sized enterprises, agricultural development, institution and capacity building. There are a number of things that go under these headings, right? So you can consider these all different types of development aid. So more recently, the EU created the Emergency Trust Fund for Africa. Part of it was with the explicit purpose of trying to keep more people in African countries, right, through development interventions. And here they were doing this through economic development interventions, employment creation, basic local level service provision, migration governance and management, and improvement of overall governance. But a lot of money that it's also gone into this trust fund has been specifically to also, for example, train border guards and train migration officials in African countries, all right? So we can also talk about how we use development aid and what's categorized under development aid that can also be really problematic, but that's maybe something for a later discussion. All right, so does aid actually work? Okay, so for it to actually work, aid must be targeted and effective, all right? So it needs to be clearly targeted to those who need it, and then you generally also need some kind of scale. So even though you might have a small effect, sometimes you would need so much extra development aid to flow into that country to really see a sizable difference that this is politically impossible. We're talking about like taking current development aid budgets and multiplying them by like 10 or by like 100. That is never going to happen, all right? All right, so does aid actually affect development? So there's a lot of skepticism in the development field about how far aid actually does impact development. So we might see positive outcomes for a specific local context or a pilot project, but in how far aid is really able to help us sustain longer term economic growth, that's a big question mark, okay? So there's a lot of skepticism about the ability of development aid to affect large changes also in youth unemployment. And youth unemployment is one of the biggest things that's actually driving migration from developing countries. And that is something that it has not been great at targeting and being very effective in the past. And there's also little evidence that aid helps to mitigate conflict. Conflict is another major driver of migration, okay? A forced migration, of less chosen migration, but it is a major driver, and aid's not doing a lot to stop that, all right? Aid can help people in a crisis situation, but it's not really stopping conflicts. So a lot of these so-called root causes that we hear about are actually not being properly structurally addressed by development aid. All right, but let's look at some of these interventions and see what actually happens. Well, if we actually look at the evidence in this field, what we actually see is that if we do see an effect of development aid on migration, it's actually a positive effect, not a negative effect. So generally, the more aid that we see going to a specific country generally means that we're going to start to see more migration from that country. And it's likely to actually stimulate more lower skilled migration. And that's just aid in general. If we talk about bilateral aid, like the US to Mexico or the US to Honduras, for example, that is likely to stimulate migration even more. All right, so there are a number of reasons for that. Part of that is actually just the development effects of allowing people to be able to then migrate, but it's also when aid comes in, so does knowledge, information, people, and ties start to be made also between countries. Sometimes aid is also in the form of scholarships, which is directly actually leading to migration. So there are a lot of reasons why this can be, but already just from the first evidence, we see that more aid is probably going to lead to more migration. All right? So bilateral aid, it goes even more. And there's no systematic effect, as we've already talked about, if there is going to be a transition before this kind of tipping point, which already means the majority of countries in the world haven't gotten there. So even as development continues, we're likely to see more migration before we would see less migration. All right? So again, showing you where some of these tipping points are. So if we assume that these tipping points are correct, all right, and that we need to get to this point, if we look at growth rates in developing countries, that are the ones that we're talking about. So when would they actually get to these tipping points? So based on historical growth rates, right here, That means it's not going to be until 2200 that you would actually see a tipping point. So before that, migration is just going to increase. If we're super optimistic and we say in a historical growth rate plus 1%, then we're still at just before 2100. And if we're crazy optimistic, which is very unlikely, especially given all the conflict we see currently, at 2%, we're still at like 2070, all right? So if we see growth and development happening like it does, we are much more likely to see a lot more migration, actually. So just development is not the answer to less migration. I'm not sure that we should have an answer to less migration. We should have an answer for less, perhaps, forced migration. We want migration to be chosen. But even in this context where I'm taking the rest of that even out of the story, this is what we're really practically looking at. All right, so aid doesn't really seem to be effective enough in its current form to make any real underlying changes to migration decisions on a large scale. In poorer countries, in the least developed countries, we're much more likely to expect development aid to increase migration. And at the micro level, the deterrent effective aid only seems to be the case when they're at higher levels of income, which are unlikely to happen anytime soon. I should say, though, a caveat here is that we do see that when development aid is channeled into specific areas, so especially in institutions, in governments, and in anti-corruption, there it can have a difference. All right, but it's in these very specific areas where most of the money is actually not going, where we could see it making a difference. But what does change with development? So as countries develop, is how we, let's say the global public, sees migration. So at very low levels of development, it's, we're going to close our borders, stay out of our countries. But as you get to the higher levels of development, the way we talk about migration completely changes. Then it's a global race for talent. Then we're trying to attract the best and the brightest. And then countries are competing with each other to try to get the most highly skilled people around the world, all right? So that's what's really changing with development, is how we see migration and how policy is constructed around that. Another thing that we do see, though, is that we see a direct effect on development aid spending towards migration with development. So countries at the lower ends of development, you see like USAID, or on the other side like German Development Cooperation or EU Development Cooperation, you see a lot of money being pumped into countries on lower levels of the development spectrum with the explicit purpose to try to stop migration, even though all of the evidence suggests that's not going to be the case. All right, so that's how we can see development aid affecting migration. So now, how does migration affect development? And this is an area that's probably been more studied, all right, in the literature. So the relationship between migration and development really is conditional on a few things. So one is, what type of migration and what are the conditions of that migration? What kind of development are we also talking about? And through what channels? So what type of migration? So there's likely to be a developmental difference depending on if it is short-term migration or longer-term migration, if it is voluntary migration or involuntary migration, if it's highly skilled migration or low-skilled migration, if it's regular migration or irregular migration, and a number of other factors. So under some of these conditions, you're likely to see much higher developmental effects than under other conditions. So for example, if migration is voluntary and regular, you're much more likely to see much more positive development benefits than if it is involuntary and irregular, for example, okay? And we can go through a lot of these different areas, but the conditions, so the type of migration and the conditions under which migration are happening make a big difference for those developmental impacts back in the countries of origin and on the migrants themselves who are migrating. So what else matters? So I'd like to talk about the different channels through which migration can affect development, and we can take this kind of 3 T's approach. So one is the transfer of people, all right? So that's just the person themselves leaving, moving to another place. So immigration, emigration, and return, all of these things can affect development. So immigration can affect development in the country of destination, emigration can affect development in the country of origin, and then whether or not people returned or the conditions under which they return. Then you have also the transfer of ideas, knowledge, norms, values, skills. So we often call these social remittances, but you have these different transfers of norms and values, but also skills and how to do things. Then we also have the transfer of financial assets, and here we call these remittances or financial remittances. So this is sending money between countries. So this can also be the salaries, this can be the savings. So development is going to be affected through these things, the absence of a person and the transfer of knowledge or the transfer of economic resources. And each of these types of transfers can imply both positive and negative effects. And sometimes these things are also happening at the same time. So for example, it could be that economically a household, a family is better off because someone migrated, but maybe from a mental health perspective, they're less well off. So you can also kind of have multiple things happening at the same time. And then what kind of development? We can think about living standards, health, education, economic well-being more generally, safety, security, new rights. So a lot of different things happening here. And if we look at the effects of migration on development, we can look at this both in the country of origin where the person is coming from and the country that they are going to. So right now in the literature, specifically the migration and development literature, a lot more time is spent on the country of origin and less on the country of destination. Now there's plenty of literature that talks about the effects of migration in countries of destination, but then they often don't use the terminology development, which I think is also problematic. Because migrants and migration is also quite impactful from a developmental perspective, also in countries of destination. So just to give a quick example, in the United States, immigrants have a much, much higher rate of patenting than locals do. So immigrants are stimulating innovation in the United States at a much higher rate than locals are. And that you definitely can talk about development, okay? But for the sake of time, since most of the literature is on countries of origin, I'm going to focus here to give you some different examples on how this can work. And so all of the effects can be both positive and negative, and we can have them at the household or individual level, at the community level, or at the country level. And sometimes something that might be really good for a household is maybe not great for a community, for example. So again, it's all not extremely straightforward. So let's take the macro or the country level perspective, first of all, on the positive side. So if a country is dealing with a lot of youth unemployment and then a lot of those people leave, this helps to take pressure off of unemployment in that country, all right? Also, the remittances that come back are really helpful for the balance of payments. Countries can also use the remittances that are coming in, the foreign currency that is coming in, to actually securitize against loans, like with the IMF, for example. So it can help them to raise even more external financing. So there are a number of things that can happen here. There are a lot more, I'm just giving you a few examples. So at the meso or the community level, a very positive thing that could happen is that, for example, because households that have migrants have more resources in them, they're able to access more health care. Their children are more likely to be vaccinated. And that's good for the people who also don't have migrants, because that means that there are fewer children likely to get their kids sick now, right? If there are more resources in the area because of migrants and migration, also it might mean that now a health clinic sets up in that community because they know that there are people with resources there that can pay for those services, and that means other people also get access to them. So these are just a few examples. But of course, on the negative side, we can see that in certain communities, high numbers of healthcare or education professionals leave to migrate, because those are highly in-demand skills also in other countries, which can exacerbate an already existing problem, meaning that there might be an access problem now to healthcare and to education. So you might have heard this as called the brain drain. So I try not to use that term because I think it's highly problematic, but this is maybe how you've heard of this context before. So it is the larger out-migration of highly skilled in an area where those skills are still quite needed, all right? And then at the micro level, at the individual or the household level, here you could see a number of positive benefits. So in households that have migrants abroad, you see the children are much more likely to be going to school. You see that they're much higher likelihood of accessing health resources, medicines, things like that. You see better child mortality outcomes happening also. So a number of things here. But of course, on the negative side, you can also see that, especially if parents are migrating, leaving their children in the care of someone else, this is not necessarily bad, but of course it can affect the relationships with children. You can see maybe higher rates of depression or anxiety. There can be plenty of other things that are going on here. And we particularly see negative effects when someone migrates from the household and the household has invested a lot in this. Sometimes they have sold land or resources. Maybe they've taken out big loans to finance someone's migration. And then if that person gets to the destination country and is not able to get a job or is maybe detained and deported, now the household is worse off because of that migration, because there was no payoff from this big investment that they made, all right? So there can be positive and negatives, but we see the main negatives happening when there's this major investment made and no return. All right, so these are just some of the ways that migration can affect development. So now, showing you some evidence from this large-scale project that was already mentioned earlier, the MIGNEX project, which is aligning migration management and the migration development nexus. There were key questions here within this 6-year, very large project. How does development affect migration and vice versa? And how are these effects mediated by policy? So this was funded by the European Commission. If you're interested, the project just finished and everything is available on the website. So all of the reports and also all of the data is also now available. So if anyone's interested, you can also use that. So we collected data across 26 different research areas in 10 countries in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. And you can see we also took a cross-section of different types of countries. So many of these are major sending countries. Some of them are not. Some of them are known as major transit countries like Turkey or Tunisia, for example, and countries that are typical labor migration countries and countries that are maybe more typical forced migration countries like Afghanistan or Somalia. So we collected both quantitative and qualitative data here. So we did a large-scale survey in all of these areas. We also did focus groups. We did policy mapping. We did loads of stuff. But for the purpose of what I'm going to show right now, I'm just using the survey data. So the survey data is representative of young adults between the ages of 18 and 39 in these local areas. So we're covering over 13,000 individuals. We chose this group specifically because this is the group that is most likely to migrate. This is an age category where people are making decisions about their future, their more general life aspirations, and we really wanted to understand this. So one of the things that we did is try to look at some of the direct effects of migration on multidimensional development. All right, so this is one of the background papers. It's available in case you're interested. And we looked at these 5 different dimensions of development. So we looked at wealth and assets, education, health and nutrition, participation in social capital, and security, to see if we had different associations with different types of migration. Now, I'm not going to go through all the findings here, but just give you some examples. So for example, what we find on wealth here, these are all of the different research areas and then the entire sample together. So an orange dot here means that we find a positive association. Purple dot means we find a negative association. And the larger the size of the effect, and the darker, the more significant it is, okay? So we're just trying to visualize this. So what you can see pretty clearly is that with wealth, if there is an effect or if there is an association, that households that have a current migrant or a return migrant or are receiving financial remittances are much more likely to be better off from a wealth perspective. We see something similar with land ownership. But it's not always the same, and we see different effects in different areas, and things can also be quite mixed. So if access to emergency money is also much more, participation in the community in general is also more positive, But you also see areas where we have no association or no effects. And then if we look at some other areas, like subjective child health, we actually didn't see many effects here, and they were quite mixed. So in some areas, we actually saw, that receiving remittances was associated with worse subjective child health. And we can get into, why that might be, and issues around selection in certain areas also. Because this is really just looking at associations now, not really the causal side of things. Also, if we look at hunger and food security, we also see a mix here, depending on the different research areas. So that's just a little bit on some of these direct effects. So what I think is important to understand here is that things are not always the same, and context also matters. So something that might be very positive in one context might not be very positive in the other context, and that is usually because of the things that I talked about before, the type of migration that is happening from that area. So in some of these places, you might have a lot of returnees because you have a lot of deportees, for example. So a lot of people may have been deported from Pakistan back to Afghanistan. That is not an environment in which we would expect a lot of positive development, right? So again, the context really matters in all of these things, and the type of migration and everything else that is involved there. So another thing that we did then was not only try to look at the direct effects of migration, but also look at some of the indirect effects of migration. So what we did here was to look at, for example, girls' schooling, and you have the direct effect of, okay, so how does migration affect girls' schooling? So you might just have more remittances, more financial resources in the household, so you might be able to send girls to school more often, even if you're making a preference for boys. If you get more resources, you're like, okay, then I'll send my daughter too, okay? But what we were interested in is, okay, we know that direct effect might be there, but what about these indirect effects? How does migration maybe change norms and values around gender and around whether or not it's good to send a girl to school? And so what we actually find is that having a migratory experience in that area actually does change gender norms around girls' schooling and around gender norms more generally. And then those gender norms also have effect on girls' schooling. So we have both a direct and indirect effect happening in many of these areas. All right, so final thing I want to talk about is how not being able to migrate, particularly when you want to migrate, but also just in general, not being able to migrate when that might be a good decision for you, how that can affect development. All right, so this is some research also from Lant Pritchett and from Michael Clemens, and this is in a USAID, U.S. Anti-Poverty Program context abroad. Basically what they show here is the two bluish purple have to do with anti-poverty programs and the effect that that has on reducing poverty in these countries, in Ethiopia, India, Pakistan, Ghana, and Peru, all right? And then they compare that to a lower bound estimate of a wage gain that a low-skilled migrant would get by moving from one of these countries and working in a very low-skilled occupation in the United States. And what you see really, really clearly is that probably if we actually care about reducing poverty and increasing development in countries around the world, the best anti-poverty program you could have in the United States is actually increasing regular migration, okay? So the gains to more regular migration are so much higher than the gains to any of these anti-poverty programs that the US also pays for in other countries. Here the US doesn't even pay anything. This would just be letting your borders be more open in a regular way, all right? And this doesn't just mean open borders, it means give more visas, create more legal pathways to migration. So if you actually care about reducing poverty around the world, this is your most effective strategy. Now, of course, there are a lot of competing interests, and that is maybe not the top priority of governments or even of a population in the country, right? So while most Americans might say, yes, we would like to eradicate poverty, they're maybe not willing to eradicate poverty by opening up the borders, right? Or by allowing more people into the US in a regularized way, all right? So Now I'm going to talk a little bit about involuntary immobility. What is involuntary immobility? So involuntary immobility, broadly defined, is the condition of having the aspiration to migrate but lacking the ability to do so. So this is someone wants to migrate, but they cannot do it for one reason or the other. All right? And now how does that affect development? Now, again, in the MIGNEX study, we asked ourselves this question. Our main analysis was looking at involuntary immobility and how this is related to economic, social, and political action, with the idea being that, all right, that's in your area of origin. If someone can't migrate and they really want to, does this mean that they're going to get very frustrated and withdraw more from their local community? And maybe that's really bad for development? So this was our question, and that was our original hypothesis, with this idea that if you really want to migrate and you can't, there might be this frustration effect and a withdrawal effect. That was our original hypothesis. So how do we do this? We measure involuntary immobility by looking at 3 different dimensions. So one area here is that people just have no migration aspirations. So that is, people are not basically under these conditions. So they say that they would prefer to stay rather than move to another country during the next 5 years. They also say that if someone were to offer them a ticket and a visa to migrate, they still wouldn't go. So we're even taking away kind of the policy constraints and all of these things, saying we'll give you the money to migrate, we'll give you a visa, under those conditions would you go? And people have said no to both of these things. So these are people who are really our stayers. They say, no, we really, really want to stay here. And this is about 33% of our sample. Then we have people who have quite strong migration aspirations. So these are people who say all 3 of these things. They have seriously considered migrating during the past year. They would prefer to migrate to another country during the next 5 years, and they would be ready to migrate if they were given a ticket and a visa. So this is not just answering yes to one of these. They had to answer yes to all of these things for us to consider that they have very strong migration aspirations. This is about 22% of our sample, and this is the group that we currently consider involuntarily immobile, because they really want to go, but they actually haven't gone yet. Yes? So do you mean, are you asking about in one of these specific questions? Mm-hmm. So that means that they would do it. They would do it. So we actually asked, would you do this? Yeah. And so they say yes to that. And then our third category is what we call kind of intermediate migration aspirations. So they're not clearly stayers, and they're not clearly people who want to leave. They might say that they preferred to stay, but they might seize an opportunity if it was given to them. So they're kind of more mixed, wishy-washy in here. And this is about 45% of our sample. All right, what we also do is check if they expect to migrate in the next 5 years, right? Because you might really, really want to go, but if you still expect that you're still going to be able to go in the next 5 years, this might have a different effect than if you don't think you're going to be able to still go in the next 5 years. And that's about 17% of our sample. All right, so how do we operationalize these different areas? So on the economic engagement, we look at if they are unhappy with their current economic situation, if they are actively seeking new work. So they could be employed, they could be unemployed, but they're not very happy with it, so we're looking at if they're actively seeking new work. On community engagement, we look if they've participated in any voluntary or community group in the last year. And then under political participation, here we do this based on 2 different questions. So here they would participate in a protest if they cared about the issue. So this is not that they have done it, but if there was a specific issue that they cared about, would they actually go out and protest? And if they were eligible to vote in the last election, if they actually voted. All right, so these are the 2 things that we use here. And what do we find? So just to be clear, this is our immobile population, so the ones that really wanted to migrate. And this is compared to people that do not want to migrate at all. What we find is that they are much more active on the economic side, on the community side, and the protesting side than people who do not want to migrate, which was basically counter to our original hypothesis. So we actually find that these people are more active, and I'll explain that in a little bit. And even this kind of wishy-washy, ambiguous group, at least on the economic side and on the protesting side, they are also still more active than people who don't want to migrate at all. Then what we do is add in, this is with all the controls too, just to be clear, I'm just showing you the most interesting outcomes here. So even if we add whether or not they expect to migrate in the future, we still see that even while controlling for that, they're still much more active, this sort of involuntarily immobile population. So why do we think, oh, I should come back to that. So on this kind of very objective side of things, we see that involuntary immobility is, let's say, not leading to worse development enhancing behaviors, right? Because we were afraid that people were then just kind of fully dropping out of the labor market, fully pulling back from like societal engagement. That does not seem to be happening. So I guess that is good news. What we do see, though, is that if we look at life satisfaction, there's an effect there. So you see people who are immobile here is the dark orange compared to the gray bar, and it is shifted to the left. So life satisfaction is between 1 and 10, 10 being the highest levels of life satisfaction. So if you want to migrate and you are not able to migrate, you seem to have lower levels of life satisfaction than those people who do not want to migrate. And if we just make this a dichotomous variable and split it, you can see this much more clearly, right? So this immobile population is much more dissatisfied with their life than the no migration aspirations, we're happy to stay here group. So while we might not see these negative effects on this objective side, it is definitely affecting people's kind of happiness and their more general well-being. All right, so what we see basically in the end here is that it's not having this effect that we thought it would have, but it is affecting life aspirations, and we think this is mainly coming because we're having some kind of selection effect. So the people who are already most kind of go-getters in life are also the ones who are likely to be the ones who most want to also migrate. So it is about these kind of underlying characteristics that we were not able to control for. So we did control for things like risk preferences and things like that, but for example, we didn't take a personality test perspective also within the survey, which would have been great, but it was already extremely long. So there were some things that we just could not control for, but we control for all of the big things that we usually look at, and we really think this is a selection effect of, which also goes to show you again that the people who want to migrate are exactly the ones you probably want to migrate as a receiving country, right? They're the ones who are the most active, the most go-getters, the people who are most likely to really make it and do something good also in the destination country society. So we see pretty strong evidence for this selection effect here. All right, I still want to leave some time for questions and discussions, so I'll leave it there just in case you are not a migration person and you want to learn more about migration. I have a YouTube channel that is focused on really bringing information about migration to the broader public. There are over 200 videos on this channel, so if there are different areas that you might be interested in, different countries, things like that. And maybe for those of you who are also teaching, it's a very helpful teaching tool because also in the description, I always put a list of references and further reading and further resources that might be helpful for people when they're writing research papers or things like that. So that's there if you want it. Otherwise, I'll stop there and I'm happy to have a discussion.
Thank you. So I'm going to turn it over to in the room for a couple questions, and then we have a couple online, so I'll come back.
Thank you very much. This was fascinating and really surprising in a number of areas. One of the questions I'm curious about, first of all, I note that you spoke about irregular migration and other forms of migration, and also with respect to that, returns, et cetera. But your point on the number of patents generated by immigrants versus native-born citizens of country A, B, or C it seems to me particularly striking. The question I have is, have you correlated that observation, or has the group correlated that observation with educational levels and also the legality or regularity of their immigration status?
Yes, so if we talk about if we're talking specifically about patenting here, And this type of, yeah, okay, well, okay, then that gets a bit more tricky. But let's say it's mainly having to do with, this research is mainly having to do with regular migration and highly skilled migration, right? But you can still look at migrants. Basically, you can correlate a highly skilled migrant and a highly skilled local, and a highly skilled migrant is still more likely to patent at a higher rate than locals are. But let me come back to another thing. So we actually also have evidence that shows that higher levels of low-skilled migration also lead to more innovation in a country. And why is that? So we have the evidence that shows that, actually. So it's because lower-skilled migration, it's actually quite gendered here, helps to free up highly skilled women's time. So if you have someone who can do childcare from you, clean your house, maybe cook meals, things like that, and it's not only about domestic work, but that's a part of it, it helps. So lower skilled immigration frees up more highly skilled native time to be able to basically be more innovative, be more productive than the things that they're normally. That's what we see in the research. Because I think everyone understands quite easily, like, okay, great, we bring in more highly skilled people, we'll get more innovation, right? That's why there's a global race for talent around the world. But I think what a lot of people don't understand is that even bringing in low-skilled migration also boosts innovation in the country, if there's a high demand for low-skilled labor. Yeah. A lot of hands. Am I supposed to take them, or is someone else?
So I'm going to ask one from online real quick. Somebody said that they were confused about your and Dahas's methodology, how or what kind of development is being deployed in the charts in your argument. So this was about halfway through your presentation. Yeah. Is it more toward the old understanding or SINs? If latter, how are the metrics constructed?
Yeah, so that is based on the Human Development Index. So that's already bringing in issues, things around life expectancy, health, education, and living standards. So on some of them, where I was showing the Human Development Index, it's already taking a multidimensional approach. On the other ones, when I actually showed a monetary amount, then that was just taking a GDP perspective, GDP per capita perspective. I probably should have been talking there. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. But thank you so much. It's fascinating the amount of research you have shown here. We need time to
yeah, it was a lot.
It's a lot. But yeah, I have a comment, a question, and then like a comment connected. My question is about the data set that you are working with this new matrix of these countries. Mm-hmm. Are you taking into account people in the countries and migrants from those countries, in this case, your location in Europe? That's one. And the second is, have you guys done any kind of comparative, like looking at this matrix of these big global data sets of migration that you show at first, that of course are connected to mobility, basically, and Europe makes 28 countries in which you can mobilize. I mean, of course, the number of people that are part of that is humongous. Yeah. Right. Then it's really easy to see why development and not development, whatever. I mean, I think that's too general, but you are doing a nuanced kind of connection. Is there any correlations between the new data set with this global mobility? Not really immigration, mobility kind of readings that you show at first?
Okay, so in the data that we collected in these 10 different countries, so we did all the data collection in that country. So we didn't match it with like who's in Europe, and the people could have been anywhere, right? So we do know where the people are. So we went to different households, but we interviewed one person who was between the ages of 18 and 39. So we take a lot of information on that person, but then also information on the household. So we know if that household has a migrant abroad or a returnee, or if they're receiving remittances. And if they have a migrant, we know where the migrant is. But all the migrants are not in Europe. You also have some that are in the Middle East or other parts of Africa or whatever. And so we do a lot of analysis also looking at different destinations also. In the project so far, we have not necessarily linked the global data sets with our data sets. Well, that's yes and no. So I try to show you some of the more simple analysis that we've done, but we've also, to try to get more at effects of things, we've tried to use instrumental variables, also an instrumental variable approach, and then we're usually using these larger international data sets on the country level, right? Because we collected our data that is representative of that age group in that locality, but I would not say that, we collected data in 2 areas in Tunisia, and I wouldn't say those 2 areas are representative for Tunisia. So you also have to be a little bit careful there, because we were really trying to look at local level dynamics. I don't know if I answered your question.
So I do have one more from the chat, then I'll come back to the room, sorry. Why don't more countries emulate the Philippines model of education for export, especially in the healthcare area?
That's a good question. Actually, a lot of countries want to or are trying to. Here we can definitely talk about capability. I should talk here. Here we can. Oh, it's there. Okay. So here we can definitely talk about capabilities and abilities. And I mean, you need also a pretty decently functioning government to also be able to put these things together. But you have a number of countries who wish they were the Philippines. I mean, I've done a lot of work also in Ethiopia, for example. And Ethiopia wishes they could export at the rate and the skill level that the Philippines are. And I think what we do see is a lot of countries trying to emulate that and work towards that currently. I do think we have to be a little bit careful, because you can also argue of whether or not the Philippines has also been caught in a sort of migration trap, in that they've spent so much time investing in immigration, or like they've spent so much time investing in skills for export, that they also haven't probably spent the time that they should have investing in things also in the country to help development there also. So, I mean, that's also a bigger discussion, but of course, Ethiopia would love to be the Philippines.
Thanks, that was a great presentation. So, I mean, the data is so overwhelming and consistent, and with everything, that those of us who work on migration know from Heinda Huss's work and so on. How is the public and how are the politicians so dumb about this? I mean, it's like everything suggests that they should be arguing the opposite of it. I mean, the simple answer is that to get votes and to put fear in people's hearts and so on. But you work on this all the time. You must think about this issue a lot.
Yes. So I think what is really hard about the topic is that it's not rocket science, so everyone thinks they know something about it, right? If someone just knows a migrant down the street, or they get information, in the news, they think then they know everything about migration. And it is so much more complicated and so much more nuanced. But it is easy to take a soundbite on something. Look, politicians often actually have the right information and purposely are not using it. And you do see, so I do a lot of work with governments, actually, a lot of work with governments and international organizations, and it definitely happens when you're talking to a government and they're like, so, okay, how do we get this outcome? And then you explain, or they say, well, how can we, if we do this, we'll get this, right? And I say, no, that's not what you're gonna get. You're gonna get this other thing. And then they're like, but are you sure your research is right? Because all they want you to do is back up whatever their political party has, right? So what's really problematic about the area of migration, especially if we think about like public policy more generally, like many of you I think are also working at public policy institutions, migration is one of the areas where you hope that you have evidence-based policy. And then we can talk about like, evidence-informed policy. So migration is one of the areas where we have like evidence-free policy. Okay, so people are just making policy not based on evidence, but based on populism and gut feelings. And what you really see is, at least in my experience, a lot of bureaucrats, a lot of the people who are actually working in the field know what's actually going on, but they will willfully disregard the information because it does not work for their party platform, and it does not work to get the votes that they want to get. And I mean, look, a lot of these things that people also say have some kind of element of truth, but they're not nuanced at all, right? So it's not that no immigrant causes a crime, right? I mean, if you have this many people in the world, you're gonna have good and bad of everybody, right? But they don't put anything in perspective. So in general, immigrants have much lower rates of criminalization than locals, much lower. But that doesn't mean that you still can't find an immigrant murderer and then make that a story. So I think the problem is that nuance gets lost in the discussion completely. And another issue is that nowadays the topic has become so politically divided that we can't have an honest, open, and nuanced conversation about migration. It is you are pro or you are anti. And that is not the conversation we should be having. We should just have the conversation of, okay, migration is a fact of life. Now, under what conditions can we have the best outcomes, right? So another thing that Hein de Haas often says that he gets really upset about is he's often asked by, the media, like, are you pro or, you're very pro-migration, you're anti-migration. He's like, would you ask an economist if they're pro or anti the economy? It just is. It just is, and now how can we best manage it and make it work for us? And that is how we should be thinking about migration, and that is not how migration is being discussed today.
So I do apologize. We only have time for one more in the room. But if you twist your arm, I'm sure Melissa will stay later and have further discussions with you. All right.
You pretty much answered what my questions were. Basically, I was going to say, who's using this, and who do you want to use it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, honestly, it's really difficult also as a migration practitioner and someone who is like, obviously, I'm pretty out in the public space and pretty vocal. And then that is in itself tricky, right? Because someone can chop you up and make a tiny little soundbite of where I have also said an area where migration can be problematic without all the other caveats that I gave, right? So that's difficult. So who I want to use this is like, well, I would like practitioners and policymakers to be using this to really better understand the topic. Because what we also see is that a lot of times practitioners or policymakers are rotating in amongst lots of topics. So I don't know if you know how, like development cooperation works or ministries of foreign affairs. People are not specialists, they're generalists. So they rotate into topics and then they don't know a lot about what they're talking about. So I hope that this helps. I hope that we can start to try to educate the general public more. I hope that through teaching and students, we can also get the word out, because it's really about nuance here. And of course, there's also such a thing as responsible journalism. Sorry, these are all so much bigger topics that we can discuss. But actually, one time something happened, and I don't know if you know who Nigel Farage is. So he was a big Brexit, anti-EU campaigner. And at some point, I realized that he had tweeted some of my stuff, and I was like, "What did I possibly say there?" That could, because you're. And I went back and looked at it, and I was like, I don't think this is problematic, so I have no idea why he used it. But that can happen too, right? You start to get worried about why, and sometimes you'll see that one of our migration scholars gets a big hit and is going on social media like crazy, and you're like, what did they say, or what was pulled out of what they said now to try to back up some point or some perspective. And it's also really hard with journalists, because I'm also interviewed a lot by journalists, and I want to be really nuanced and say, well, under this condition, under that condition, right? But all they want is a soundbite that says, it is like this. And you cannot say that about a topic that is so difficult, that is migration, right? Well, already when you talk about who an immigrant is, I'm an immigrant, but when most people look at me, they don't think of me as an immigrant, they think of someone else who they consider problematic. And the fact that we already have this kind of wrong connotation about this, what should be a very neutral term, migration, is already problematic. Sorry.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking Melissa for coming today.
Thank you.